I'd like to welcome all of you to our event today. We also welcome Dr. Hayward back to campus for the second lecture of his visiting series this semester on conservative philosophy, past and present. Today's lecture is on liberalism versus so-called neoliberalism and why socialism is becoming popular again today, a question I'm sure we've all been wondering in recent years. Firstly, for those of you who aren't aware, the Buckley program is an organization dedicated to increasing intellectual diversity and free speech on Yale's campus. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and conferences. By becoming a Buckley Fellow, you have access to an array of fellow-only events, such as private meals with our guests, dinners, complimentary attendance at all of our events, including our annual conference in November, the Ideas Forum in January, and of course the highly anticipated Disinvitation Dinner each April, which this year will be held in honor of Dr. Henry Kissinger. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow at our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now on to Dr. Hayward. Stephen Hayward is currently a senior resident scholar at the University of California's Berkeley's Institute of Government. Dr. Hayward has written books on topics such as the environment and President Ronald Reagan, and is a noted expert on the Reagan years in America. His writings have been featured in many prominent publications, such as the New York Times, the National Review, and the Wall Street Journal. We're very excited to have Dr. Hayward here with us today to share his thoughts and expertise. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Hayward.
Thanks. Well, it's terrific to be here once again. Thanks for coming out in this cold afternoon. I'll try to warm things up a little, I guess. And my notes say, first sentence, we live in strange times. That's always true. What a dumb thing to say. But things may be a little stranger than usual right now, and I'll give you some examples, or we can talk about some examples during the question and answer period. But the reason I thought of that, setting out that we live in strange times, in connection with today's announced topic of the revival of socialism, is that it was only 30 years ago or so when the Soviet Union collapsed rather ignominiously, and that there was, in general around the world, a steady retreat of government control of economic life. Even in China, of all the seemingly unlikely places at the time, everyone thought that socialism was dead. The thesis was put most vividly in the frame of the famous Francis Fukuyama book, The End of History. Some of you may have either read it or have heard of the title. It lives on in a lot of ways. And his main argument was that the classical liberal idea of limited government, secular democratic institutions, and market-driven economies was vindicated for all time. That was it. We'd arrived at the final stage of historical development of human society, and even thought that would be true of the Islamic world at the time. And even many socialists or their fellow travelers thought that if socialism's not dead, at least it's on life support or in need of some serious renovations to preserve one or two little pieces of it. So, for example, in the late 1980s, rather late in certain ways, you had the socialist-leaning Labour government of New Zealand facing a stagnant economy and growing political discontent that reversed course so dramatically you would have thought Margaret Thatcher had put mind control chips in their dental fillings. It was a Labour government socialist minister who led the way in privatizing state-owned industries, selling off public lands, deregulating markets left and right, banking, housing, financial, all kinds of services. They cut taxes, and they reformed a number of their social welfare entitlement programs. And that was a socialist government abandoning socialism. Something similar happened in France. It was nowhere near as radical as what you saw in New Zealand, but they abandoned a lot of their longtime socialist projects and objects, such as nationalizing the banking sector. And then there's Britain's Labour Party, which was in eclipse during the entire 1980s under the enormous shadow of Margaret Thatcher, and they lost election after election on their old-time religion of nationalized industry, high taxes, trade protectionism, also pacifism. And by the early 90s, they reversed course and very ostentatiously junked some of their old commitments to nationalized industries and to high taxes and so forth. And thereupon, they went on a very successful run in power under Tony Blair. And what did Blair do? Like Bill Clinton here, he embraced free trade. He embraced a lot of other market-friendly policies. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Clinton here in the U.S., in the middle of his first term, when he was in some difficulty, he announced his State of the Union speech in 1995, "The era of big government is over." Caught a lot of people by surprise. In typical Clinton fashion, though, he didn't say that big government was over, just the era of it. And if you listen to the speech or read it afterwards, he then went on to propose 50 small ways government could be bigger and do more things for you. That was very typical of Clinton. He was masterful at that sort of thing. And then, as already mentioned, China decided that what it needed after decades of economic stagnation was to embrace markets and capitalism and trade, albeit with a very heavy state involvement. And behold, it's now the world's second largest economy in little more than a generation. The most astonishing statistic about China, I think, there are several that are really astonishing, but the one that grabs my attention is that the last 10 years, or you can move back a couple years, take a 10-year period of fairly recent times, it'll still be the same statistics. China poured more concrete than the United States did in the entire 20th century. Let that sink in. It's probably more than they need, probably more than they should, I don't know, but that'll tell you how rapidly has been the economic growth and development of China. I think it's worth noting, since 1980, it's not that long ago, not quite 40 years ago yet, 825 million Chinese have been lifted out of poverty into the ranks of the middle class. That's a staggering number. And on the other hand, we have right in front of us in real time, literally today, as literally overused all the time, we have an example of a socialist catastrophe in the case of Venezuela. And yet, despite that catastrophe that we can see right in front of us, recent opinion surveys show that socialism is gaining favor. The term is no longer a stigma for American politicians to embrace openly. And even if we apply a discount to what people mean by socialism, often a lot of people who say this, what they really mean are the social welfare democracies like Sweden and Denmark, not the old 5-year plans of the Soviet Union. Or I would have said that until I read the Green New Deal proposal that came out this morning, which does look like an old 5-year plan of the old Soviet Union, except Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calls it a 10-year plan in her talking points about it. So 5-year, 10 years, whatever. But until today, I would have thought that most people meant Sweden or Denmark, and that's fine. But still, the fact that you can now use the socialist label again is pretty astounding. Now, I think to better understand what's going on requires stepping back and taking a wide view of the whole scene, and it comes in 3 parts. The first part is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a couple of basic aspects of a market economy that have gotten out of focus, or maybe have not been recognized as clearly and widely as they should in the first place. Second, I think we ought to refresh our understanding of the 2 main parts of Marx's basic argument for socialism. We tend to remember one, but not the second one. And despite all the twists and turns of the last 150 years, they're both still around, I think. And then third, I want to put both parts of the argument, the free market argument and the free market principles, Marx's critique and his successors, and put them back together with the current form the debate is taking, and that's the debate over a critique of what the left calls neoliberalism. So, for part 1, the commonplace summary account of capitalism usually starts with Adam Smith. There are other antecedents, but Smith's the main one. And it's still taught this way, that Adam Smith emphasized several things: the division of labor, specialized labor. If you've read The Wealth of Nations, it begins with how much more productive a pin factory would be if workers aren't each making an entire pin themselves, but do specific tasks on an assembly line. But he also went on to talk about the importance of free trade, and philosophically, how self-interest would be a worthy motivation for people in the marketplace, guided by what he called the invisible hand, that famous metaphor, which would be a much better regulator of the market than politicians. You needed open entry competition, that's important. And you also needed state protection of property rights and contract rights if the whole system was going to work. If you'd had insecure property and contracts that could be broken at will, then it was unlikely to be successful. And this kind of political economy, Smith and his successors argued, would be more efficient, more productive, and would maximize growth and wealth, although not necessarily ensuring the equal distribution of the growth, and that has always been the moral and political Achilles heel of capitalism. It was then, it is today. And although there have been lots of subsequent modifications and insights to Smith's framework, and here plug in any number of the names of the great economists of the 19th and 20th centuries, like Ricardo, Mill, Marshall, Schumpeter, John Maynard Keynes, and many others, Smith's remained the durable foundation of modern political economy. Then along comes Karl Marx with the most formidable critique of Smith and free market economics. And it was powerful not merely because of its economic content, but also because it had a radical philosophical critique. I think you need to keep both of these together in your mind. On the economic side, Marx thought that capitalist competition, which so often manifests itself in falling prices for consumers, but also in an unstable, he thought, boom and bust cycle. He thought that would result in shrinking profit margins, and that would mean that the owners of the means of production would have to exploit and oppress the workers, have to squeeze wages down in order to preserve profit margins. The only way out of that, he thought, aside from his revolutionary solution, would be monopoly, and that monopoly is just as bad as destructive competition. The later Marx and some of his successors refined this critique to include lots of explanations of surplus labor, ingenious views about banking. Imperialism, of course, becomes a very important explanatory factor for Lenin and others. And also, and this lives on today very vividly, how the boom and bust cycle would become used by the ruling class as part of its tool in the permanent class struggle. Now, there are many things wrong with his economics that I'll come to, and I think the history of post-Marxist thought can be summarized as the attempt to keep the core idea of class struggle alive in the face of so much contrary empirical data and contrary experience from just about every attempt at real socialism. Thomas Sowell comments, I'll quote him here, "It would be difficult to find even a single country ruled by Marxists where the standard of living of working class people has been as high as that of working class people in a number of capitalist countries," close quote. But that's on the economic side. On the philosophic side, I think Marx is in some ways more interesting. The self-interest that Adam Smith and Locke and Montesquieu and the other thinkers of the classical liberal tradition thought would be moderated and channeled for the public benefit through commerce appalled Marx. He thought that kind of self-interest was an abomination. Marx thought that egotism and selfishness or self-interest, however you want to describe it, was unnatural. He thought it was the creation of the idea of privacy itself, whose cornerstone was private property. And he's not the first person to think that. You find it, in a sense, in Socrates' thought experiment in the Republic. Rousseau thought something similar. But to make a long story very short, Marx thought, abolish private property, and you can begin to change human nature itself. I say begin to change human nature because a lot of real-world problems flowed from that premise, especially the politically convenient idea that the false consciousness of the working class, who didn't get the point, that their condition was created by property, which they craved and tried to acquire, that this false consciousness justified the tyrannical rule of the communist elite. It was the great insight, especially of people like Orwell, to understand that whatever the merits of seeing the world in terms of class struggle, which, as I say, is as old as Plato and Aristotle, Marxist doctrine offered a sophisticated rationale for a competing ruling class, the revolutionary ruling class, whose organized violence was much more brutal and extensive than any predations of the corporate boss. This was, of course, the famous dictatorship of the proletariat. And you can also see in this the makings of a secular religion, which is what Marxism in practice often became, sometimes explicitly so. I mean, if human consciousness is controlled or distorted, either by material forces or by cultural forces, that's the explanation of the modern successors of Marx, then the task of politics is changing consciousness and the redemption of humanity through conversion of some kind. It's amazing how thoroughly that idea of redemption through politics has crept into mainstream political thought today. I'll just give you one example. This example is a little bit old, but it's still striking. I remember seeing an Al Gore op-ed in the New York Times about why we have to conquer climate change. And along the way, he said, addressing this problem will be an act of human redemption. It's And there's a language of salvation. It's not enough to solve a practical problem that has lots of technical aspects to it. He has to conceive of it in terms of human redemption. Gore is not a Marxist. He's not an extremist. But he has absorbed that messianic aspect of politics. And that's a problem for extensive discussion. Now, the problem with Marx's scheme, especially his economic scheme, is that history didn't unfold according to his dialectical plan. The working classes weren't driven into deeper and deeper poverty. The revolutionary class consciousness didn't take hold. And despite the boom and bust cycle of the industrial age that does cause real political tensions, we have seen long-term growth removing millions, and recent decades, billions of people out of poverty and into the middle class. Social mobility has tended to be upward and not downward. Now, many of Marx's contemporary heirs say, well, he just had his timing wrong, and that his basic predictions of the skewed concentration of wealth and downward mobility of the working class are finally coming through today. Now, the statistics about this are in dispute, and I won't attempt an eye-glazing review of them now because, for one thing, it requires PowerPoint, which I resist as much as I can. But I want to just note instead that this is not unique to our time, the things you're hearing today. My favorite example is a book from 1906 called Why There Is No Socialism in the United States by a German scholar named Werner Sombart, who was himself a socialist. Sombart wanted to explain why the United States was a deviant case in the grand narrative of class struggle. And the basic reason, by the way, I recommend the book. It's in the library. You can find secondhand copies. It's been kept in print over the decades, this book from 113 years ago. The basic reason he settled on in great detail was simple. The American working class was so much better off than the European working class. It was paid better, it ate better, lived better across the board. And it was not even close. Sombart went through and offered lots of data tables of wage levels, prices, the size of average housing of apartments, and what their amenities were. And sometimes he would go city by city, not just in general terms. He would compare Pittsburgh with Stuttgart, for example. And he thought at the end, this will be temporary. And here's how he ended the book, quote, and by the way, if you think 1906, that was the era, as the historians told us, of the robber baron. The language about the ultra-rich then is very similar to the language you hear about millionaires and billionaires today from Bernie Sanders. So as I say, some things don't change. At the end of the book, Sombart said this, quote, all of the factors that have prevented the development of socialism in the United States are about to disappear or to be converted into their opposite, with the result that in the next generation, socialism in America will very probably experience the greatest possible expansion of its appeal. Now, at first you might say, you had to wait a long time for Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to show up, not just one generation. On the other hand, he was right in a certain sense. In the 1920s, and especially with the coming of the Great Depression, socialism did get very popular. The American Communist Party received still, I think, its highest ever raw vote total in the election of 1932. I think that's still true today, even with the much larger population we have. The communist candidate in 1932, a guy named Foster, got over 1 million votes. So maybe he wasn't entirely wrong, and you begin to make out a hypothesis that maybe this goes in a certain epicycle, and that maybe today we're back at one of the upswing epicycles like Sombart predicted. So I don't want to pick on him for, he didn't predict that it would succeed, he just said it would be popular. And we can admit that he was right, perhaps. But let us linger a moment and reflect more closely on the general failure of socialist economics and make a few points about the reasons, the deepest reasons for those failures. Maybe one way to start is to note the results of what I like to call, and others like to call, the greatest controlled experiment in human history, the comparison of some capitalist countries next to socialist countries of similar characteristics. In particular, West Germany versus East Germany from 1945 to 1990, and North and South Korea from 1953 to today. In 1945, as everyone knows, Germany was nearly destroyed, though it did have a lot of human capital, trained engineers and scientists, doctors, bankers, managers, and skilled workers. Now, West Germany embraced the capitalist market economy, quite aggressively so in the late 40s under the legendary finance minister and later Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, while East Germany went in for the centrally planned socialist economy. And the result by 1990 was a gap in real per capita income of about 2 to 1 between West and East Germany. Not that this was noticed by liberals in the West. I say liberals in the West. You might say the sort of established intelligentsia. So here's an amazing story. This is only 30 years ago now, a little more than that. In 1986, the CIA produced a special estimate of economies in Eastern and Western Europe. They said that the Swedish economy was larger, the East German economy was larger than Sweden's economy, and that real per capita income in East Germany was higher than real per capita income in West Germany. Do you know this story? Pat Moynihan used to be the greatest critic of this story. He'd say, any taxi driver in Berlin could have told you that was utter nonsense. But for some reason, our CIA never talked to any taxi drivers in Berlin. And when the Berlin Wall came down and Germany was reunified in the early 90s, and people got into the files of the East German intelligence service, a very competent intelligence service, right? But they took note of what the CIA was saying about East Germany and were alarmed at how bad and inaccurate American intelligence was. And they thought, America doesn't take us seriously. And they thought this might be dangerous. If the Americans are this out to lunch, so to speak, on what conditions are really like in East Germany, what else might they not know and get wrong, right? North and South Korea present the same controlled experiment. The whole peninsula was destroyed in the Korean War. South Korea embraced capitalism, not without its fits and starts and military dictatorships and lots of political problems, but they embraced capitalism for their economic system and became a prosperous middle-class country. While in the North, there's been a scene of famine in recent decades where the average height of a North Korean is about 2 to 3 inches less than the average height of a South Korean. Or again, I mentioned Venezuela, once a very wealthy country by regional standards, where the GDP has shrunk by almost 2/3 in the last 15 years. Even some of its neighbors who struggle with corruption and dysfunctional economies like Argentina look stellar next to Venezuela today. Now, occasionally you hear the cliche that Venezuela or East Germany or the Soviet Union or wherever is either not real socialism or real socialism has never been tried. And this becomes something of a cliche and even a slur. I think we should take seriously the charge of incompetence or corruption that's embedded in the sincere form of that claim. And because I think we need to understand why socialism is inherently incompetent and also likely prone to corruption. And to do this, we need to move forward and take in something of a blind spot for both Marx and Adam Smith. Now, I think one of the obvious errors of Marx and his successors is to view economic phenomenon as a zero-sum game. It's often the premise of the kind of things you hear, like the rich are getting rich today at the expense of the poor. Well, the math of that doesn't really work, but that's a common sentiment you hear today. The more accurate statement would be the rich are capturing the largest share of economic growth. That claim is, in general, true. Now, the unstated premise of the socialist outlook seems to be that if there were no private property, resources would naturally be equally distributed to everyone. Though I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any society where this has ever been true of any kind. Second, I think related to this is Marx partakes to some extent of the Malthusian fallacy that resources and economic output are relatively fixed or limited. Although it's important that Marx disagreed with Malthus, that population growth would be a driver of ever-increasing poverty. Marx thought Malthus was wrong, but they do make a similar mistake, I think. Maybe it's the same mistake, in supposing that growth in technology can't keep pace with the needs of human society and the growth of human populations. So I've already suggested, but to restate an earlier point, since the Industrial Revolution began roughly 300 years ago, 250 years ago, at that time it began, about 90% of the world's population lived in poverty, or near it. Today that number's down to around 20% and continues to fall steadily. Now, the curious thing is that for all of our advances in economic knowledge and technical data measurement, sophisticated modeling, and other insights, the causes of economic growth remain controversial. I mean, Econ 101 used to teach, may still teach, that it's all a function of land, labor, and capital. That's what you learn the first 5 minutes on day one, and there's a certain amount of truth to that. But the fact that there's so much variation in economic growth rates around the world makes you realize that it's not that simple. And so among economists and economic historians today, there's a vigorous debate about what are the most important primary factors to explain the astonishing growth of the human economy in the last 250 years, and what sustains it today. So some people say it's institutional structures such as democracy and the rule of law. Others say it's technological advancement, that we reached a critical mass of things like the steam engine and steel, and you can think of the tangible things you can identify. In our time, it's information technology is obviously hugely important. Some people say, like Deirdre McCloskey, I think one of the most interesting writers on economic history and theory today, that it's really a matter of changing human consciousness. The broader story of liberalism, she argues that very powerfully in 3 very large books that I highly recommend. Secure property rights, open markets, you can point to statistical analyses that vindicate each one of these, and then you'll have the economists will argue with each other. It's fun to watch. But even there's so much variation in what people think. Now, I don't want to try to go through those different schools of thought, except to say, and come to the central insight of Friedrich Hayek, that if our knowledge of economics were comparable to chemical or mechanical engineering, we wouldn't have all these mysteries about booms and busts and what makes for prosperity and how to keep prosperity going. We would have figured out a long time ago how to smooth out economic cycles, and at various times we thought we had, only to learn 5 or 10 years later that, oops, it didn't work. Friedrich Hayek wrote to the economic journalist Henry Hazlitt, quote, "Our possibility both of explaining and predicting social phenomena is very much more limited than it is in physics." Now, why is this? Hayek offered, I think, one of the best single-sentence formulations of the problem, and he was a person given to very long sentences. I call him sort of the Henry James of economic writers, and so I'll say more about that in a moment. But he once said, "The basic task of economics is to understand how little we know about what we think we can control." How little we know about what we think we can control. See, the premise of socialism is a complete or near complete mastery of all the important factors of economic life. And this simply can't be made to work. Hayek called that premise the fatal conceit. Now, let's see if I can explain it a little bit, why he thought that. The 2 key factors are, I'll put it this way, knowledge and destruction. Second one will sound puzzling, but I'll come to that. Whereas Adam Smith emphasized the specialization of labor, division of labor as a key to productivity and economic dynamism, Hayek and other economists, Joseph Schumpeter, who was a sympathizer of socialism, said, wait a minute, what's actually underneath the division of labor? What's underneath that is what Hayek called the division of knowledge. The division of knowledge. I recommend to everyone, you can find it on the internet, an essay of Hayek's from 1945 called The Use of Knowledge in Society. And I'll explain it in a minute, but I want to mention in setting this up that about 3 or 4 years ago, the American Economic Review, the premier journal in the field, impaneled about, I think it was, I forget, but a cross-section of prominent economists from across the political spectrum, and they asked them to come up with a list of the 20 most significant articles ever published in the American Economic Review, which was founded, I think, way back in 1889. And they named this essay of Hayek's, The Use of Knowledge in Society, among those 20. And the irony there is that that article probably couldn't be published in the American Economic Review today, but not for ideological reasons. I'll leave that as a puzzle for you elsewhere why it wouldn't. In any event, it's well respected even by people who disagree with Hayek's specific views. And what he said in that essay was, look, economic activity consists mainly of what? Allocating resources. And if you're going to try and allocate resources by some central political direction, through central planning, through a 5-year plan, whatever, it requires a central planner to assimilate and gather a lot of information. And as Hayek puts it at the end of one of his very long sentences, I'll just give you the last clause, he said, "The problem of planning is a problem of the utilization of knowledge not given to anyone in its totality." In other words, I'll restate it this way. A planning process will never have enough information to make good economic decisions. Now, does a market do that better? If it does, how? And the key to a thriving economy, he went on to explain, is that information is dispersed. And it's communicated chiefly through price signals. You see a price of something go up, you say, oh, well, it must be a shortage or a disruption, and depending on what business you're in, you will look for a substitution, you'll look for a new supplier, you'll raise your price, you may adjust in any number of ways. And you might not get that right. Hayek's not saying that individual actors in a market have perfect information or even complete enough information themselves. There are lots of examples can be offered on this point. One that may be a current one is you might walk down the street in a big city and you'll see a Starbucks on that corner and a Starbucks across the street. You go, well, that's odd. Why, And that may be dumb, by the way. One of those may close down. Someone may open a second bakery. Here's Panera and here's one of the other chains. And they may both thrive, they may not. The point is that a marketplace will discover that quickly, whereas a planner never would. The Soviet Union always was trying to plan in detail how much food are we going to need in the next 5 years, how many shoes, how many shirts, in great detail, and then send out orders to the factories to produce all these things. It never worked very well, obviously. Now, that's the problem with sort of the, what you might say, the extremes, a completely open market and a completely planned economy. But the limitations of knowledge actually applies to a lot of regulatory schemes that you might say a mixed economy has. Price controls, we've had price controls in this country, still do in a couple of markets. Entry barriers, material and labor mandates, especially land use regulation and things like rent control had an enormous distorting effect on the American economy. Increasingly, economists think that land use, over-regulated land use planning in this country may be a significant contributor to the slow growth rate of the country in the last 30 years. And as abundantly exploited by public choice theory, the government itself becomes a self-interested party, and therefore the handmaiden of special interest rather than a neutral arbiter. It's a really very legitimate question people on the left raise more than people on the right, that sometimes people get rich not because of their success in the marketplace, but because of political favoritism. Now, Schumpeter brought one more insight to this, and then I'll move on to the third point. Just as Marx and Smith thought competition would be the big driver, price competition, it would be Starbucks against Pete's Coffee and, Panera Bread versus one of the other bread chains and, McDonald's versus Burger King, their dollar menus. And, of course, that's true, and we're all familiar with all that. But what Schumpeter understood was what he called the process of creative destruction. What really moves a dynamic, open economy is not direct head-to-head price competition. It's what he called creative destruction, where a new mode, not necessarily a new product, but it could be a new mode of organization, overcomes and replaces the old one. A really good one right now to think about, because it's quite controversial, is what gets called the gig economy. All these people working for Uber and Lyft, sometimes at the same time. I'll often get an Uber car and I'll see it's got both the Uber and the Lyft sticker on it, and the driver is deciding who's going to use which app first to summon the driver to come pick him up, him or her up, right? And talk to Uber drivers, if that's their main job, they make a lot of money. They hustle at it, and they like it, most of them. And organized labor and a lot of liberals really don't like it. They want it to be regulated. In California right now, there's been a lawsuit going through the state courts to require that, well, it's the classification of employees. The gig economy is independent contractors. And the argument is, wait a minute, if you're working on the conditions that Uber specifies for you, you're not really independent. there's some plausibility to that argument. The latest entry into the debate about this was 2 days ago. One of America's most famous independent contractors, a woman named Stormy Daniels, had an article in the Los Angeles Times that said essentially, hands off strippers. That wasn't exactly her words, but it kind of fits, right? But she made an argument. We want to be independent contractors. We don't want to be tied down to being employees of all the places that we tour and do our thing, right? So another thing, unpredictable, right? You never know where this argument and who's going to be making certain parts of the argument. Let me share you a little bit of Schumpeter. Quote, and it's from his great book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which is great reading. He was a good writer. He didn't have everything right, but he had a lot of things that were right and were just interesting reading. He said, this process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. It is what capitalism consists in and what every capitalist concern has got to live in. Economists are long last emerging from the stage in which price competition was all they saw. As soon as quality competition and sales effort are admitted into the sacred precincts of theory, the price variable is ousted from its dominant position. However, it is still competition within a rigid pattern of invariant conditions, methods of production, and forms of industrial organization. But in capitalist reality, as distinguished from its textbook picture, it is not that kind of competition which counts, but the competition from the new commodity, the new technology, the new source of supply, the new type of organization, the largest scale unit of control, for instance. And he goes on from there and says that's, it goes on for a long way, but today you will know the phrase that's the equivalent of this, it's in our discourse, which is disruptive innovation. That's the cliche of our time. And there's just lots of examples. In the power sector, it's cheap natural gas has been displacing coal even without regulation. Apple completely disrupted the personal computer industry starting 35 years ago, though not without a near-death experience for the company. Evening news on TV destroyed the evening newspaper. There were evening newspapers when I was a kid, and now there are none. Meanwhile, the 24/7 cable channels and the internet have destroyed most morning newspapers. I mean, they're still around, but they're dying fast. Streaming video has destroyed DVDs, which had previously destroyed video cassettes, which had previously altered movie-going patterns and the economics of movie making. Anybody here have a fax machine? That came and went in less than 30 years. And by the way, there's an interesting story about the fax machine that illustrates the central planning and impulse for regulation and control that almost nobody knows about. You may know that the U.S. Post Office has a monopoly, a legal monopoly, goes way back, hundreds of years, beginning of the post office, on the delivery of first-class mail. You can't, FedEx and others, they can't deliver letters. FedEx and UPS exist an exemption of package delivery. They can't deliver letters. That's illegal. Well, now what do you do with fax machines? Well, you send letters, or at least we did when we had them. Now we scan and email them, right? So when the fax machine was first being developed and brought to market to connect your phone lines, it's before you had any wireless devices, right? 35, 40 years ago, the post office went to the Federal Communications Commission, which had jurisdiction since this would be a device using the telephone lines, the wire carriers. And the post office made the following argument. Excuse me, but the fax machine is going to be used to send letters. That's our business. Therefore, it is our expectation that fax machines shall be limited to locations only in post offices, so that if you want to send a fax, you will have to go to a post office and send it to a fax machine at another post office where the other party can come and pick it up. They actually argued this to the FCC. And the FCC said, that's nice, but that's really dumb, go away. And it didn't happen. You could have a fax machine in your home. But can you imagine? That's perfect bureaucratic logic, by the way. And it is the kind of logic of the old planned economies. You could find countless examples of things like that in East Germany, the old Soviet Union, and so forth. Some of the other stories, cell phones, of course. Phone booths are almost extinct. Walmart killed Sears and Kmart. Amazon killed most major bookstore chains like Borders. Barnes & Noble's hanging on for dear life. Although here's another surprise. It comes back to this division of information point of Hayek's. So in the last 2 or 3 years, you thought, that's it, bookstores are finished. Who could be in the retail book-selling industry anymore? Except maybe a college bookstore, which has a niche of supplying college students with their textbooks, right? Turns out in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a significant uptick in the number of small independent booksellers. They're often specialty sellers, people who do, science books, mystery books, used books. Some are there for the experience. They'll have a little, coffee bar attached to it. I mean, Barnes & Noble has that, but, your local store is a place you get to know. It's like your local bar. And so, there's an example of what you thought was going to happen or what was predicted hasn't taken place. I can go on with examples like that. General Electric, which was once the most valuable company in America, has just about killed itself. And of course, the big one right now, I'm hearing a lot about this, is what about artificial intelligence and robotics? Is that going to render a lot of low-skilled jobs, especially like drivers, which is mostly male, truck drivers, right? So they're going to render their jobs obsolete. Maybe, I don't know, except this is also not new. If you go back to the early 60s, there was a similar worry about what was then called automation. And those predictions have often been correct in a narrow sense. We now make in this country, I don't know what the right number is, 2 or 3 times the number of automobiles we made in the 1960s, with a workforce that's a third the size that it was in the 1960s in our auto plants. And that's because we've moved to robotics and a long time ago in our auto factories. And yet we don't have mass unemployment, right? Hard to see how these things will go. Now, I'll move here to my concluding section. Thomas Sowell observed, quote, "Socialism in general has a record of failure so blatant that only an intellectual could ignore or evade it," close quote. Well, that's the superpower of intellectuals, of course. If the biggest flaw of Marxist economics is its underappreciation of growth and social mobility, the biggest flaw of capitalism is the social instability that results because of its dynamism. And also especially the boom and bust cycles that it's always had, sometimes severe like the Great Depression and the financial crisis 10 years ago, sometimes less so. Sometimes it's regional. This is part of the Donald Trump story, is all those old industrial towns of the upper Midwest that decayed starting in the 1990s and very rapidly the last couple of decades with not much to replace it. It's precisely this instability of market economies that gave rise to the latest successor of Marxist political economy, which goes today under the label of neoliberalism. And this is a puzzling thing to me in a number of ways. Everyone's heard of neoconservatism. And I think I explained this to some of you who might have been here, that began really as a bunch of disaffected liberals in the 60s and 70s who were not hostile in principle to the welfare state, not hostile to government intervention in markets. In other words, they weren't libertarian purists by any means. They just wished the welfare state worked better, that we knew more about our social order and how it worked. They came to realize, as Nathan Glazer, who just passed away 2-3 weeks ago, put it, that a lot of our interventions backfired on us. That was part of the legacy of the Great Society. And it was thought in political terms that the neoconservatives were more politically realistic, and it was a refuge for moderates and disaffected liberals. And there's a lot to be said for the fact that this neoconservative move in the late 70s was part of the story that brings Ronald Reagan to office. So there you get into the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan is smashing liberalism and the Democratic Party into tiny little bits. And a number of centrists and moderate liberals said, we need the liberal equivalent of neoconservatism. We need neoliberalism. And there was even a book in the mid-1980s called The Neoliberal Manifesto, edited by a guy named Charlie Peters, very interesting guy, sort of a moderate liberal, was the editor of the Washington Monthly magazine, which was very much worth reading in those days, and now is a shell of its former self, like so many magazines, unfortunately. And that neoliberalism was entirely about rescuing and reviving the liberal tradition of activist government, which was in eclipse under Reagan and Thatcher over in Britain. And what those neoliberals said was, we still want the old liberal goals for the Democratic Party, but technology has changed and our understanding of markets has changed. So we want regulations and a general policy that's market-friendly and uses markets where we can. And it never took off. You never had any politicians or many thinkers saying, I'm a neoliberal, the way you had people on the right saying, I'm a neoconservative, or that's a neoconservative idea. It died of mourning, in other words. But then suddenly in the late 90s, the term came back, but not as something to be embraced, but as an epithet of the left. If neoliberalism was meant to be sort of a hopeful thing in the 80s, by the 90s and later, neoliberalism meant evil to the people who used the term. Now, at first, I thought neoliberalism was just another name for capitalism and a way of repackaging the old Marxist analysis of boom and bust cycles. And as I say, a view that's been given fresh wind by our, the wage stagnation of the last 30 some odd years and by the financial crisis. But it's much more than this. And I've been reading a lot of the literature, the critical literature about neoliberalism, and it's much more than just pro-market ideology. Neoliberalism is understood as a comprehensive ideology whose main object is securing the power of the international ruling class. It does sound very much like Marx repackaged, right? And it verges into conspiracy theory territory, because you'll find that just about anything that's a problem or that you can point to is part of the neoliberal agenda. And there's even a strong overlay of postmodernism. Foucault comes in as one of the premier analysts of neoliberalism, although it turns out if you read Foucault's late work carefully, you'll see he's much more ambiguous about the nuances of what he called neoliberalism, much more so than the people who invoke his name. Now, I'm going to return to the subject of neoliberalism when I come back from my final visit in April, because I'm going a bit long here, but it sets up the final point for today. The opening sentence of Schumpeter's great book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, opening 3 sentences, are these. Quote, most of the creations of the intellect or fancy pass away for good after a time that varies between an after-dinner hour and a generation. Some, however, do not. They suffer eclipses, but they come back again. And they come back not as unrecognizable elements of a cultural inheritance, but in their individual garb and with their personal scars which people may see and touch. As I say previously, Schumpeter's great book got a number of things wrong, but a lot of things seem right on the nose for our time. He thought bureaucratic managers of both public and private sectors would undermine public support for capitalism. And more, his big point was that the very success of capitalism in delivering general prosperity would be its undoing. A growing intellectual class, he thought, would be hostile to capitalism. And here's another irony, I think, is that Marx and his successors, who are so keen to class interests, remain resolutely oblivious to the idea that intellectuals might have a class interest of their own. Hayek has another essay I highly recommend called The Intellectuals in Socialism. And he has it's a sort of understated essay, interestingly enough. It's not in a polemical style, the way I'm kind of putting it. There's no bombast in it. But essentially, one of the points he makes is, socialism or a transition to some kind of socialistic system would require active management by intelligent and well-trained experts. Well, who would those be? In other words, one of the attractions for an intellectual class is that it would empower them, right? So I think, to restate my thesis and draw very quickly to an end here and take questions, you have a confluence of cycles of economic history and some genuine difficulties with market economies as they've struggled in the last couple of decades, along with, you might say, a forgetfulness from a younger generation that doesn't know some of the experiences firsthand of real socialist countries, along with a perennial interest in intellectuals in the kinds of schemes that would empower them. But you can go further. You can explain it even in spiritual terms, and I think there is something to this. Whittaker Chambers described communism or socialism not as a new phenomenon, but as something very old. In the opening of his book, Witness, he said, socialism is man's second oldest faith. Its promise was whispered in the first days of creation under the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Ye shall be as gods. It is the great alternative faith of mankind. Like all great faiths, its force derives from a simple vision. I think it's considerations like these that explain the persistent appeal of socialism and its utopian variants. It will wax and wane, but it will never go away. And so we should not be surprised at the socialist revival taking place today, and my advice is to buckle up for a very interesting historical period ahead. Thank you. And how are we doing for, okay. Good. I've left a little bit of time for questions. We want to get a roving microphone so it gets on camera if anyone has a question or comment. We got one up front here.
Thank you. So, in the State of the Union, President Trump strongly disavowed socialism in the U.S. becoming a socialist country. Do you think that that protectionist trade could eventually actually play into the hands of socialism by restricting free trade?
Oh, that's a great question. If you didn't all hear it, it was a great question. Trump attacks socialism, and yet he's practicing protectionism himself, and doesn't that risk playing into the hands of socialism or socialist impulses? Oh boy, that's a great question. I have no idea how that. My predictive powers are pretty poor. Generally, I think Trump's policy ideas on trade are bad in principle, but might work in practice. And that's only because of the peculiarity of Trump. I mean, we've been complaining about unfair trade practices for my whole adult life. It was Japan 30 years ago, and it's been China for the last 20 some odd years. And you've had people threaten. You know, Mitt Romney said, I'll declare them a currency manipulator, and you've had the Democratic candidates say, I'm going to get tough on China, and then not much happens. And the reason not much happens is that the orthodox free trade argument usually wins when you sit around and try to think about what to do. So we complain to the World Trade Organization. That takes time, and it's slow. We complain to the Chinese, and, you know, they'll say nice things, and not much changes. And then along comes Trump. And he says, I don't care, I'm going to do it, right? And it looks like he's got a lot of people really rattled in a way that only a person like Trump could carry that off. And so right now, the best case, we might get lucky. I think Trump might get the Chinese to behave better, to open up some of their own, reduce some of their own unfair trading practices and with other trading partners. And there's some evidence of this. I mean, the Chinese economy is under some pressure, and you hear lots of stories about Trump has them seriously rattled. You can see why, because it's so crazy. And so it might work, but it might, you know, it might end a disaster. It might end in a trade war. The Chinese are patient people. They've, you know, their president there says, "Hi, I'm president for a long time. How long are you president for? Another 20 months, maybe." So I could see it going the other way. I could see it leading to a trade war with all kinds of dislocations. And then what you get is, you know, one way this plays out is not full-blown socialism, but then not just protection, but then subsidies for uncompetitive industries or subsidies for industries that have been hurt by trade. We have a little of that now. There's existing law that allows Trump to take the tariff money and give it to soybean farmers, but not to certain other industries. So it's very partial. You're lucky if you're part of that and not. And so, yeah, the potential for it to go badly is certainly there. But I would not make a firm prediction. I'm watching this with just great interest and amazement, though. Because no other president would have had the, I don't know if you'll call it courage, foolishness, gumption, stubbornness, idiot. Use whatever adjective you want to describe it, and I will accept it. What's that? Chutzpah. I don't know any other president or any person than someone like Trump who would attempt this. And so we'll see.
I know, like, in all these conversations about socialism and libertarianism, I was sort of reminded of Milton Friedman, who I remember was, of course, a famous defender of the free market and suggested a negative income tax on the poorest people in society. How does that fit into all of this? And do you think that's like a viable solution, or is that a possibility either politically or just practically?
Yeah, well, so, I didn't talk about it today. I talked about it a little, I think, on my last, maybe not much, I don't remember now. Friedman was always for what he called the negative income tax, which is if you're, I mean, it's his formulation. I think he proposed it around 1960, a long time ago now. And obviously, if you don't make enough money to pay income tax, maybe the system, and he wanted a simple system, you would get money back from the IRS. It's come back today in what's known as the universal basic income is the idea now. In around 1970, it was around under the name guaranteed annual income. So again, not a new idea. And there's a lot of division about this. I know liberals who don't like the idea, and I know a lot of conservatives who do like it. So it crosses lines a little bit. I think it should be understood in a wider context, which is I talk about the boom and bust cycle, and then the other problems we talked about, wage stagnation and so forth. And the basic argument is at least 100 years old that, I think Churchill put it best, is that a society that does not have social insurance risks social revolution. Another industrial society. He said it is not, well, he thought it was not just, but also politically unstable if you have a large class of working people who are one accident or one illness away from destitution. This is the case of the British working class, 1900, right? That's true here, true of any industrial country. And industrial countries are generating all this wealth, never mind the billionaires and that problem that arrests our attention, but a country with that kind of wealth ought to be able to provide some kind of safety net. Church was the one who thought up that phrase, safety net, which has also waxed and waned. So yeah, the idea of a universal basic income assures a minimum standard of some kind. Charles Murray, of all people, not of all people, I know him real well, he wrote a whole book 15 years ago about why we ought to have one. And along the way, by the way, I know him real well, and I bug him about this. He said, part of your guaranteed annual income is a requirement that you buy health insurance with it, a mandate, right, which became such a fuss with Obamacare. There are other versions of this around right now. I'll just mention one. So the liberal solution to low wages right now is raise the minimum wage. And there's dispute about this, but most economists will tell you that's a bad idea, especially for low-skilled people. But the concern about low wages, people aren't making a decent living at whatever level of their age or skill level. Why are we loading the remedy of that onto employers? And so the idea that's being floated around now by people similar is a wage subsidy. So that, McDonald's can hire the teenager who's never had a job before, needs to be trained and so forth, and that person will get a decent wage, but you're not making the employer pay for all of it. So that idea is being actively kicked around, including by some libertarian-minded people. So the idea of social insurance, but that's a different thing than socialism, of making resource allocation decisions and saying who's going to make how much of what, right? So we tend to use the phrase socialism to describe any program that involves a redistributive element, and I think, yes, it's true that socialism implies redistribution, but it doesn't have to. And I think we should try and make more clear distinctions about what we're talking about.
If no one else has a question, I do. Following up on that, Tucker Carlson a couple weeks ago made pretty serious waves for a monologue, sort of redefining right-wing populism in terms of economic populism, and sort of this space he sees in economic policy for more interventionist government, particularly towards people like Trump voters.
Yeah.
Where do you see that going? How do you think, he made a very ideological argument, but not a very policy-specific one. What sort of policies do you think tie in with that?
Yeah, so that's fun. First of all, I'm going to be doing an event with Tucker in San Francisco in a month or so, in March, and I'm going to debate. I know him a little bit, not well, but I'm going to debate him about that a little bit and press him on the matter and make him extend the argument. He's doing it in a TV segment of 5 or 6 minutes, and actually 6 minutes on TV is a long time these days, but it's not anywhere near enough to lay something out, right? And then I'm going to talk about the whole the whole phenomenon of populism here on one of my subsequent visits. So when I come back, I'll have a much more complete overview of the scene. But my first pass right now is, and here's where, so I'll put it this way. I'm talking about the neoliberals, and everything's part of the neoliberal conspiracy. The neoliberals hate the World Bank. They hate the International Monetary Fund. So does the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Right? Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal said it'd be better if we just abolished the World Bank. But if we have to have it, let's have David Malpass run it because he'll wreck the place. You don't say that, but they did say let's abolish it, right? The neoliberals hate the World Economic Forum, the folks who meet in Davos every year, or as I and others call them, the Davoisie, right? But so do people like Tucker Carlson, and so does Trump to some extent. Trump was, in the campaign at least, making attacks on Wall Street that were almost indistinguishable from Bernie Sanders. So part of what's going on here is populism. What is populism? I always struggle with defining populism. In this country, populism is when the wrong people win an election. I think that's what the New York Times means by it, right? Because, there was briefly a populist party in this country in the 1890s, and that was sort of a left wing. It was sort of the farmers mad about the bankers. The point is, populism usually takes the form of the people versus the powerful, and now we're arguing who are the powerful. And so some of what Tucker says and some of what Bernie Sanders says is the same. They both are after the same people People are governing in their self-interest. They represent a ruling class interest. I suggested that briefly in one sentence in my talk. And it's a very confused scene because the Democrats want higher redistributionary taxes. It's not clear what Tucker Carlson wants exactly, except he wants Trump reelected. That's what that really is. It's a thinly veiled apologia for reelecting Trump. And I get that politically. But it does leave us a little bit adrift about, maybe getting rid of the World Bank is a good idea. I can, a lot of good arguments for that from a conservative point of view. But there's not a coherent populist program except we're mad and we want to, give the middle finger to New York, something like that. So to be continued, because I think, people are asking the silent question, well, okay, yes, then what? What's the next sentence? And we're not getting that from him and a lot of people. Yeah, hopefully I get a microphone here. And then probably last question, unless somebody gets provoked here.
Well, a observation, I believe it was Gordon Chang who was here, and he did make a point of that if a significant portion of the population is feeling that the system isn't working for them, that's good enough to say something, the policy has to change, even if it isn't ideologically pure. Having said that, maybe just close by, you articulated emotionally why socialism is maybe making a resurgence. Why do the economics never get addressed in a coherent way?
Oh, well, that's simple, because your eyes glaze over with all the numbers. No, I think I think it is that simple. And by the way, the numbers can always be contested and probably always should, right? And so for I hate using the phrase the average citizen, because I'm with Ronald Reagan. I don't think there's such thing as an average citizen. But I'll put it this way, for someone who doesn't study the issues carefully and have some background economic knowledge, it's just the fog of numbers that leaves you confused and you can't follow it. And I've made a point for quite a long time now. I'm not the only one. I know a number of journalists who follow this rule. When you write about the federal budget, about taxes, try to write an entire article without using a number. And you'll find you'll communicate much better with people. I've tried to, I don't write about it much anymore. I've tried to write about the whole climate change energy stuff that way. Because you get into parts per million of a minute and all the rest of that, unless you know that stuff really well, you just get lost and your brain just shuts down, you don't follow it. I do think this because I did all my work on Ronald Reagan. His least successful speeches are the ones where he tried to do a lot of analysis of numbers, because he was actually pretty good at that. Now what he was really good at and what does work are just one number. Now what he liked to do is $1 billion deficit if it was $1 bills would stretch to the earth and the moon and back again. Doesn't actually mean that much, but it's vivid. It sticks in your mind, right? That's when he was his best. But when he was doing percentages of the federal budget for this and that and the other thing, he just fell flat. And I do think it is that simple. So yeah, what's it going to cost? How are you going to pay for it in the Green New Deal? And I didn't talk at all here. I would have been too long. The newest thing right now is called modern monetary theory, MMT. Anybody heard about this? It's brand new. Might be in the last 2 months new. It's got to be a little older than that. But essentially, it's a revival of Keynesianism. We can borrow all the money we want without constraint. That really is what it means, and it's because that's how we're going to pay for all this stuff. Medicare for all, free education. We can just borrow it because we've been borrowing a lot of money for the last 10 years, and inflation hasn't crept up, which is strange and troublesome. And so now people are saying, well, just yeah, we should raise taxes, but we can borrow all we want, and this is going to be weird to watch.
If I might leave you with one memorable number, Venezuela's inflation rate is estimated at 10 million%. That's a number that's hard to get around.
You can't measure it.
What that means
right.
is that costs double every 4 days.
Yeah.
Every
4 days.
4 days.
Are you sure it's not 4 hours? No, I don't know. How do you,
It's just doubling.
Yeah, no, it's they don't have a currency.
You can't save any money.
At that point, you're not even measuring it. Did someone else look like someone else might have wanted to ask a question? We'll do one more maybe here. I'm not sure. How long are we supposed to go, Lauren? About now? Yeah, all right. Well, I'll try not to drone on and on too long. But.
So my question's about so we're talking about the rise of socialism, this criticism of neoliberalism. And I can see how you could think that in the current moment in America, with someone like Ocasio-Cortez being put up on the public stage a lot more. But from the continental European perspective at the moment, with the European elections coming up in May, the social democracy in Europe has totally collapsed on the continent. Even though you have Corbyn and the Social Democrats are holding on in Sweden, for the most part, what you see in Europe in terms of populism is a kind of a nationalist populism that is very different than traditional class-based socialism, and it makes a lot more arguments based on culture, xenophobia, and policies that, like in Eastern Europe, like Poland and Hungary, their type of redistributive policies are much more focused on incentivizing child rearing, giving extreme benefits to, like, in Hungary, they'll give you like $200,000 for building a house if you promise to have 3 kids. And that's more what's going on in Europe today. So I just ask if you could comment on that type of populism and if that's a kind of socialism.
Well, I'll take the very last part. It's not clear to me that whether some or many of the populist movements in Europe have a quasi-socialist element to them. They might a little bit. Let me back up for a minute. If you look at the polls on, like, the Pew survey and Gallup on what are the top issues in America, immigration comes in usually 6th or 7th. The Eurobarometer polls, I look at them now for the main countries in Europe, immigration's 1 or 2. And that's because it's been proportionally larger than this country and smaller countries. Okay, so here's another interesting fact, is that you'll find that there's an inverse correlation that's pretty tight between the homogeneity of nations and how generous their welfare states are. And this is one reason why high immigration rates have been so controversial in places like Denmark and Sweden, but also Germany, I think. And so that's one of the things that's propelling the populace there, is it's not necessarily free market populism. It's not clear that's here, for that matter. But meanwhile, you're right, the center-left parties have been in retreat in most of Europe. And in England, this is where, again, England and the United States are often the outliers or the strange cases. If the Labour Party in England weren't led by somebody who terrifies too many people in the middle, I think they would clobber the Conservative Party, who have mishandled the Brexit thing so badly, right? They're so unpopular, but the alternative is worse. The same thing may happen here. I think it's a little early yet, and I don't want to do too much rank punditry, but I think there's a high probability that Democrats are going to have a very radical candidate with a very radical platform, and an awful lot of non-ideological voters in the middle are going to say, yeah, we don't like Trump worth a darn, but at least we know what we're getting with him, and this is too weird. That may happen. That's what's happening in England right now. Is the Tory party right now has moved out to a big lead in a prospective election, even though nobody can stand them, right? I think that should be a big alarm bell for Democrats here. But there's also the difference in the systems, right? Here we have this two-party system, and populism has to be assimilated in a broader party. That's what usually restrains anybody who's not like Trump. In Europe, you can have these parliamentary parties, the ones with proportional representation. You can vote for Alternative for Germany or some of these other, the National Front, what's the French party called? The Front, yeah, right. I don't know if they'd ever will get an outright majority in control of a government, but it's a great protest vote. In Italy, yes. There is exactly what I was talking about earlier with Tucker. That is a right-left coalition against the elites and against the European Union. And yeah, like I said, strap in. It's an interesting time we're in. I think it's just going to, right now what I'm hearing is, I don't follow it day by day, but you have the elections for the European Parliament, and people think that various populist factions may get a majority, or at least enough of a plurality that they can be a real nuisance to folks who run the place. Yeah, it's going to be wild. Anyway, I've run a little over time. Thank you all very much for coming.